My name is Kay. I'm a compulsive overeater, and abstinence is the most important thing in my life today. I weigh and measure 3 meals a day from the Cambridge GreySheeters. I write them down, I call them into my sponsor, and by God's grace, I have been able to do since May the 30th, 1981. I usually like to qualify at a meeting close to my birthday, but this particular birthday seemed a real milestone to me. And so I wrote out the talk, and it really has meant a lot to me to write it, to think about it, and to be able to give it. So thank you for listening. I am celebrating my life leading up to and including all the blessings I have enjoyed from GreySheet abstinence in each decade of my long life. In the first decade, from 1940 to 1950, my mother watched my weight and my diet, so I was not an obese child. Anytime I got away from my mother's control of my food, such as going to my grandmother's or to Girl Scout camp, I ate with abandon. In the second decade, 1950 to 1960, I decided to leave home and go to the convent at age 14. This was encouraged in Catholic families in the 50s. I was away from my mother, so I began gaining weight. In the convent, we had the practice of eating in silence as someone read to us from a spiritual book. The serving dishes on the table of 8 were passed around until they were emptied. As others at the table signaled that they could not eat another bite, I signaled, "Pass it to me," and I finished the food. I never could understand how a person could not eat another bite. Part of becoming a nun was a wedding ceremony in which we became brides of Christ and received the habit of the order. I was determined not to have to wear a fat wedding dress, so I quit finishing the bowls of food, starving myself in order to lose 50 pounds. And I wore a very slender wedding dress. In the third decade, 1960 to 1970, I gained the 50 pounds plus 10 more. My sister, who had also joined the convent, told me I looked like Sister Asunta from the back. Sister Asunta probably weighed about 300 pounds. So I determined to lose the ugly weight. I asked the sister in charge of the kitchen to let me have diet food, cottage cheese. I ate so much cottage cheese, it's remarkable I even like it today. And I lost 60 pounds. When we would gather at what was called the Mother House each summer, I came back after that year, and no one recognized me. I loved that. But the next year, I had put on 40 pounds, which I took off by counting calories again. And that was in order to leave the convent. In 1969, I left the convent. I met my husband. I pursued my husband. I married my husband and started gaining weight again. One of the things that I did was I used the recipes that I learned in the convent, which fed, 14 people. And then he wouldn't eat enough of it to satisfy me. And so I would get mad and eat the rest. In the fourth decade, 1970 to 1980, I had 2 beautiful children while a member of Weight Watchers. I even worked for Weight Watchers. Joe and I made a marriage encounter weekend where we were encouraged to focus on God and on our relationship. I determined that my relationship with food was interfering with these relationships, and it was Weight Watchers' fault. So I quit Weight Watchers. From that point on, I desperately tried one diet after another. I put bran in all my food, hoping it would go quickly out of my body and not stick, not having heard of bulimia. I read the Bible before every meal. I had a bite counter. It was a little machine about the size of a cell phone, and you pushed a button when you were to take a bite. And as long as this little red light blinked on it, you were not to take another bite. When the light went out, you put another bite in and hit the button and waited until the light would stop blinking. This was to eat slowly enough that your appestat would kick in. So after about 2 weeks of that, I thought, I think my appestat is kicking in. I think I felt it. Well, I told it to shut up, and I got up and got some more food. I tried to limit myself to eating only what my husband ate. He never ate enough to satisfy me. Finally, I reached step 1. I said, I will just be happy with my fat and go buy some decent-looking fat clothes. In the 5th decade, I came to GreySheet. My first day of abstinence was May the 30th, 1981. From this point to the present, my story will not be about diets, mental obsession with food, hating myself, being a slave to my cravings, and despair over my failure to stay thin and be normal with food. Instead, it will be highs and lows of my life, which I could now fully experience since I was not stuffing every feeling with food. My first test of abstinence came very soon. We went to a timeshare in East Texas. I bought a cooler large enough to hold enough food for a scout troop. I packed every single bite of food for the week, as if there were no grocery stores in East Texas, and I stayed abstinent. I changed schools that year and taught some of the most difficult students ever in my career. I used the program to make up my own personal slogan, I can do anything for 1 hour. And I stayed abstinent. Our beautiful girls began to get in trouble with drugs and alcohol, and we began what we called 5 years of hell. Sometimes it seemed that my abstinence was the only thing I was doing right in my life. In the 6th decade, 1990 to 2000, I taught at Sanchez Elementary, where I reunited with my former student from 1970. He was now a parent. We had a wonderful reunion in which he told me I was the reason he was not dead or in prison. He made me a ring for each year I taught his son, and I'm still in touch with him today. It was at Sanchez that I made up another personal slogan. Thank you, God, that I know what I do with my food. This was because they were always feeding the teachers, bringing food and putting it in the teacher's lounge. And if I wanted to get a cup of coffee or anything like that, I was always passing all this food. In 1999, I broke my femur attempting to ski. I fell off the ski lift chair because I was too afraid to get off at the right time. The first thing I did when I came to in the hospital was call my sponsor. My wonderful husband saw to it that I got abstinent food. He said he knew I didn't feel well when I accepted a small fruit without complaint. I had to fly home while Joe drove our car from New Mexico. I was met at the airport by a GreySheeter, and members of my GreySheet community brought me abstinent food and stayed with me until Joe arrived. In the 7th decade, 2000 to 2010, Joe and I retired from teaching. We took our first group tour to Ireland, where I weighed and measured 3 meals a day for 10 days with 45 people. Breakfast in the hotels was usually a generous buffet from which I also took food for lunch, filling in with vegetables from farmers' markets and small shops. Dinners were back at the hotel, where I had to ask a lot of questions to get what I needed. At the end of this Ireland tour, a woman came up to me and asked me to sponsor. I said, "You've seen me weighing and measuring all my food for 10 days. This is how I sponsor." She said, "That is what I need." Spreading the word of the program without speaking. We made group tours to Spain, France, and Portugal. We toured in the footsteps of St. Paul, including a cruise in the Mediterranean, and our last tour was to Israel. Our daughters returned to us, and I was able to wear a size 6 Mother of the Bride dress at Kat's wedding. Joe and I traveled to England, where I spoke at the London GreySheet Roundup in 2001 and again in 2004. We stayed with the most gracious hostess and friend, Pat. I was on the GreySheeters Anonymous World Service Board and traveled to the New York GreySheet Roundup, where the board met in person. In 2006, my beloved granddaughter, Shiloh, was born, the light of my life. In 2008, my beloved husband was diagnosed with brain cancer. My GreySheet community was with us through this very difficult time, bringing measured food for me to take to MD Anderson, as we spent every other weekend there for experimental treatment. Every part of this program supported me during this time. My sponsor, my sponsees, my meetings, and supported me by coming to Joe's funeral, even those who would not step into a church except to give this support. In the 8th decade, 2010 to 2020, I went through the grieving process. In the grief group at Hospice Austin, I heard people talk about not being able to get up in the morning, of starting to drink alcohol at 10 in the morning, of feeling a total uselessness in their lives. Again, my GreySheet program gave me and my life a framework, 3 weighed and measured meals a day, my call to my sponsor, the calls from my sponsees, and meetings. I got through this time and again filled my life with volunteer opportunities. I was the secretary and then the treasurer for the Southwest Intergroup, now known as the Southern States Intergroup of GreySheeters Anonymous. Traveling has become very difficult for me. Without Joe, I feel totally lost when traveling. But with the help of members of this community, I have traveled to the Malibu Retreat, to the London GreySheet Roundup, and to the New York GreySheet Roundup. I used to think that when I'm old, I would not care about being fat. I used to think that I'd just let myself go and eat anything I wanted. Well, now I am at that point in life, and I only want GreySheet food. I don't know how to eat without my GreySheet abstinence and the freedom I have around food, the freedom not to think about food incessantly, the freedom to live. I had a much harder time writing the part about this talk after I got abstinent, because my life was and is so full, not of food, but of living. There were so many parts of life to tell about that they would not fit in a 15 or 20-minute talk. And each part of this life ends with, and I was abstinent.